Welcome back, Capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today we are going over the chaos, which was week 1 of the 2024 college football season. And as always, if you enjoy, be sure to like and subscribe. Without further ado, let's get right into it, starting with our predictions from last week. Now, if you have not heard, we are potentially giving away $100 to one of our subscribers. If you want a chance at winning, be sure to follow us on our social medias. The links to those will be in the description, but that is only if we do not correctly predict over 75% of the college football games this year. Our picks from this week will be flashing up on your screen. And overall this week, we locked in and we correctly predicted 64 out of the 68 games from Thursday to Sunday. Pretty huge if you ask us. Still one game left to go, but that brings us to 66 of 72 correct predictions to this point on the year for a winning percentage of 91.7%, well over that 75% threshold. But we aren't perfect. I will let you know firsthand that you still have a great shot at that $100, so be sure to follow us and stay tuned for our updates in the future. And next, we're going to be revisiting our big impact matchups and predictions from our week preview. Starting with Clemson versus Georgia, our prediction for that game was Georgia 31-17, and the final score was much worse in favor of the Bulldogs. They won 34-3, and what else is there to say? It was a huge loss for the Tigers in Atlanta. Their offense just could not get it together, a theme which has remained true over the last few years, and we feel like we need to ask if Dabo's heart is still in it at this point. At no point in that game did it feel like Clemson's offense was trying to win. They refused to throw the ball down the field. They couldn't manufacture a ton of success on the ground, and they were ultimately held to just 3 total points. And their defense was about as good as we thought it would be. There's just no way you can hold a team like Georgia when your offense can't drive down the field, when they can't extend drives. And on the other side, it was another Kirby Smart masterclass. Great field positioning battle early on. Their defense never let up. Clock management was there. Just an A+ showing from that Georgia staff. And Carson Beck looked great. Everything about Georgia looked like the #1 overall team to us. It was a great showing for the Bulldogs in Atlanta. And our player of the game for that game is going to be Carson Beck. He was 23 of 33 with 278 yards and 2 touchdowns. And next we had Penn State at West Virginia. Our prediction for that one was Penn State 21-16. The final score was Penn State 34-12. What a day for the Nittany Lions. They looked exceptional against the Mountaineers to an extent that we didn't even see coming. Like we talked about in our preview, Penn State got a new offensive coordinator, and they came out of the gates looking like a brand new offense. Aller made some great throws, the running game was dominant, and they weren't afraid to take shots, which is crazy to us considering just how one-dimensional that offense was last year. But on defense, let's get it out of the way. We told you so. They looked remarkable on that front. They held a pretty solid West Virginia offense to under 250 total yards and had 3 takeaways on the day, just pure domination on that front. And Penn State was able to flat out stomp the Mountaineers. A great beginning for what looks to be a dangerous Nittany Lion team this year. And not a terrible loss for West Virginia. Obviously not the outcome you wanted, but there was still plenty to build off of. The offense didn't look bad. You weren't expected to win this one, and you should still have a pretty decent season ahead. The player of the game for us here is going to be Nick Singleton. He had 13 carries for 114 yards, 8.8 yards per rush, and 1 touchdown. And next we have Notre Dame at Texas A&M. Our prediction for this one was 34-21 in favor of Notre Dame. The final score was 23-13 Notre Dame. And what a great matchup this was. 2 great defenses duking it out. We predicted it to be gritty, and it was especially so for Notre Dame's Riley Leonard. He didn't fill the stat sheet, but he went out there and put it all on the line, fighting for those extra yards, taking the hits and brushing them off. A truly great game for him. And like Penn State, for Notre Dame's defense, we have to go ahead and say, we told you so. That unit went out and balled out. They held the Aggies to under 250 total yards and forced Connor Wigman to throw 2 costly picks, which is ultimately what gave Notre Dame the edge. And if you're A&M, I wouldn't overreact to this too much. Wigman isn't bad. The team isn't bad. Notre Dame just might be a 12-0 undefeated team this year. They look like a playoff team, and you guys still have talent. You can still churn out a few wins. They played a lot better and with a lot more passion than we can say they did at any point last year. So we think there's still a lot to look forward to as an Aggies fan. For our player of the game, though, we have the quarterback, Riley Leonard. Like we said, didn't fill the stat sheet, went 18 for 30, 158 pass yards, 12 carries, 63 yards, but went out and put his body on the line to get the dub for the Fighting Irish. And next is Fresno State at Michigan. Our prediction for this one was Michigan 38-17, and the final score was Michigan 30-10. And this may have just been our best prediction from this past week. We weren't confident in Michigan's quarterback situation, and we don't think Sharon Moore was either. Davis Warren and Alex Orji both looked pretty subpar in their showings, but most surprising was Donovan Edwards. He also did not have a great game. Kind of worrying to see there, but we won't jump the gun and say he's not good. He may have just needed this game as a wake-up call. Something the Michigan defense did not need at all. They looked great in this one as we predicted. They're going to be a-okay on that side of the ball, especially since they were able to hold a pretty solid Fresno State offense to just 10 points. 2 turnovers, and 9 total rushing yards. Great showing from the defense, worrying performance from the offense. And our player of the game is going to have to go to Colston Loveland. He had 8 receptions for 87 yards and a touchdown. And next was LSU versus USC, the Sunday night game. Our prediction for that one was LSU 28-24. The final score was USC 27-20. And boy, was it a good one. Very exciting matchup. 2 very good offenses and much improved defenses, especially for the Trojans. They still don't look amazing, but there was no reality last year where USC holds LSU to 20 points, even without Jaden Daniels. And D'Anton Lynn's presence was felt in that game. We have a lot more confidence in USC as a team going forward. Their offense was great. Their receivers looked elite. And their quarterback, Miller Moss, went off. He had a great performance, virtually no mistakes, very accurate and very efficient. And that should be terrifying for anyone with USC on their schedule this year. Lincoln Riley's got another QB and now a much improved defense. If they're not great, they are pretty good, and that is a massive improvement from last season. Very excited for USC this year, not so much for LSU. They're obviously not going to be a bad team, still one of the top teams in the conference, but the penalties really hurt them in this game. They seemed unfocused, unprepared, and undisciplined, which is a bad combination, and it ultimately falls on Brian Kelly. We don't think Kelly is bad, but if they want to come back and be a credible threat in the SEC this season, they need to come back next week looking a lot more honed in than they did this week. For our player of the game, though, we have USC's quarterback, Miller Moss. He went 27 of 36 passing for 378 yards and a touchdown. And for our game of the week, Miami at Florida, we predicted Miami to win 30-24, and the final score was Miami 41-17. And it was our game of the week, but it was not much of a game at all. We thought it would be tighter. We thought Florida could be better than they were a year ago, and not to overreact, but they just looked flat out bad in this game. Mertz underperformed. The defense was disturbing, horrifying, absolutely terrible. The one small sign of hope we could find for the Gators is that Montrell Johnson looked pretty solid on the ground, and if I'm Billy Napier, I'm leaning into that rushing attack for the rest of the season if I'm still employed as Florida's head coach by the end of this week. But on the other side, we're giving out our third told you so of this week. Cam Ward looked phenomenal. He should be playing in the NFL. He looked like the most complete quarterback of the weekend, in our opinion, and Miami's offense just lit it up. They burned down the swamp this week, and we are just as surprised as you are about that. And our player of the game is going to be Cam Ward. He went 26-35, 385 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. And moving on to our team and player of the week, For our team of the week, it has to go to the Georgia Bulldogs. There's a couple teams that we thought could fit here, but Georgia just flat out dominated a pretty okay Clemson team. They won 34-3, like we said, 447 total yards to Clemson's 188, 7.5 yards per play to Clemson's 3.6. And they were +1 in the turnover margin, just utterly dominant. And for our player of the week, it's going to come out of the group of 5. It's going to be running back Ashton Jeanty of Boise State, because he absolutely went off. He had 20 carries for 267 yards, over 13 yards a carry, and 6 rushing touchdowns. Just rushing, not even a receiving mixed in there. 6 rushing touchdowns, absolutely phenomenal. Jeanty is our player of the week. And moving on, we have our capital B biggest winners and losers from week 1. For the winners, our first is going to be Vanderbilt. The Commodores had a very strong performance against the team we were pretty high on coming out of the ACC in Virginia Tech. Specifically, Diego Pavia, their starting quarterback. He threw for 190 yards and 2 touchdowns and rushed for over 100 yards and an additional touchdown. And overall, they just had an outstanding day. They held Virginia Tech to under 100 yards rushing, forced a turnover from drones, and had no turnovers themselves. And we were very, very low on Vandy coming into the season, but Clark Lee and the Commodores are looking much more respectable in the SEC after that win over Virginia Tech. And for our second biggest winner, it's going to be Ole Miss. Now, we know they were playing an FCS team, but Ole Miss looked downright amazing against Furman. Over 770 total yards, very efficient on third down, no turnovers, and Jackson Dart looked elite in this one. Potential Heisman candidate. Don't want to jump the gun there, but he has to be in the mix now. He went 22 for 27 for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns, and he didn't even play the whole game. Very strong performance all around, and that gives Ole Miss a much more promising outlook heading into the rest of the season. And for our third biggest winner, it has to go to Miami. Going into Florida and getting the kind of win they did compared to how the rest of their conference did just shows us that our Miami pick coming out of the ACC was a good one. If the other ones weren't so good, Miami fans, I think you have a great season to look forward to this year. And for our biggest losers of this week, the top one has to be the Clemson Tigers. Just a bad performance straight up. Played it very safe and still looked bad. We don't know if it's Cade, if it's Garrett Riley, if it's Dabo. We can't quite put our finger on it, but it was just a bad overall day for the Tigers and has left a lot of Clemson fans unmotivated for the rest of the season. Definitely not what you want to see if you're Dabo and the Tigers athletic staff. And next for our biggest losers, we're actually going to give it to Oregon. The Ducks pulled out a narrow win over Idaho, 24-14. And just for reference, the spread on the game was Oregon -44.5, and they only won by 10. The Ducks looked good on both sides of the ball. They didn't have a bad game statistically, but a lot of the stats were empty. Maybe a little iffy in the run game, but they just couldn't score in the red zone when it mattered most. And that is not a promising sign if you're a Ducks fan. It could have been a sleepwalking type of game. They might have only gone 80% in this one, but still not a great appearance for the Ducks. We'll be looking a little bit closer at their game against Boise State next week. If it's anything like this one, we should be in for an interesting one there. And for our last team on the biggest losers, it's going to go to Texas Tech. The Red Raiders barely sneaked out of a win versus FCS Abilene Christian, winning in overtime 52-51. They gave up 615 total yards to the Wildcats, 500 of those through the air, and we really don't even know what to say about that. Like we've said, we don't want to overreact to anything in week 1, but this was just a terrible showing. If they perform in conference play like they did in this one, they may not win a single game in the Big 12. Just absolutely abysmal. The offense was pretty good, admittedly. Baron Morton looked solid. Taj Brooks looked awesome. But the defense, man, just shockingly bad. And for our next segment, there were actually a ton of great quarterback performances this week, so we're going to take a look at a few of those, starting with Jackson Dart versus Furman. Like we said, 22-27, 418 yards, 5 touchdowns through the air, and then an additional 27 yards on 6 carries with another touchdown. Great performance for Dart versus Furman. Next, we have Shedeur Sanders versus North Dakota State. and he had perfect timing in this one. He went 26 of 34 for 445 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. And next, the biggest surprise to us this week was Drew Aller versus West Virginia. Made a lot of great throws. The stats weren't as good as some of the other ones. He went 11 and 17 for 216 yards, 3 touchdowns, but he really threaded the needle on a lot of those passes. Made a lot of great reads, and he rushed for an additional 44 yards on 6 carries. After that, we have Nico Iamaleava versus Chattanooga. He went 22 of 28 for 314 yards and 3 touchdowns. We've got Cam Ward versus Florida, like we said earlier, 26 of 35, 385 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. And Miller Moss versus LSU, 27 of 36, 378 yards, and a touchdown. Great week for quarterbacks. There were even a few more that we left off, like Dylan Raiola at Nebraska. Had great showings in week 1. We're very excited going forward this season. And into our last segment, it is the O&O Sports Week 2 Top 25. And let's just jump right into it, starting with the first 5. At 25, we have a brand new team in Vanderbilt. Great win over Virginia Tech. They looked very good on offense, especially with Pavia at the helm, and 1 week in, they already have a great win. They're the newest team in our top 25, and at 24, we have Florida State. They play tonight. We don't have them moving down, so we'll have to wait and see how this game goes tonight to move them up or down again. At 23, we have Iowa moving up 2 spots. Great showing versus FCS Illinois State. I mean, it's Illinois State, but their offense looked pretty good, which is something we could say at no point last year, so big improvement there. Kansas State's moving up 1 spot, 222. They destroyed UT Martin. They move up 1 spot. As for NC State, a big surprise to us. They're moving down 3 spots. They looked pretty not great against Western Carolina. Very worried for them against Tennessee. Not too confident in them at this point, but could have been an off week for Grayson McCall. Could have a much better performance this week. But for now, we have them moving down quite a bit this week. After them at 20, we have Iowa State moving up a spot. Also not a great performance, but not bad either. Rocco Becht looked like his usual self, but the rushing attack left a lot to be desired. They'll move up for now. We have the Clemson Tigers ranked 19th. We're not sure if they should even be top 20, but we already have them falling 6 spots. Offense looks mediocre once again, but the defense should carry them to a few extra wins this year. At 18, we have Georgia Tech moving up 4 spots. The Jackets look pretty good once again against Georgia State. Not amazing, but pretty good. We have them as one of our highest risers this week from that win over Florida State and now Georgia State. Next, we have Oklahoma State staying still. Their offense looked good. Alan Bowman was efficient. Ollie Gordon rushed for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. The defense, though, looked a bit suspect, which was a worry coming into this year, but it was also South Dakota State. They're one of the best FCS teams out there. They could have gone up against Georgia and probably performed better than Clemson did, honestly. So nothing to sneeze at there. Next, we have the LSU Tigers falling 5 spots to number 16. A tough loss in Vegas for LSU. We think they're a team that can easily jump back up our rankings, but for now, they're dropping down to 16th. Not a bad team, but like we said, need to lock in and limit mistakes on both sides of the ball. And at 15, we have the USC Trojans moving up just above LSU because they beat them. Makes a lot of sense. Great performance this week with Moss at the helm and a brand new defense. USC looks scary going into the rest of this season. Could make the case for a playoff berth if they keep up how they played in week 1. Very exciting team going forward. At 14, we have Michigan standing still just because the offense didn't lend a lot of confidence to us to move them up any further. We still think they're a decent team. The defense looked elite in that game versus Fresno State, but they're going to need one of their quarterbacks to step up, and they need it to happen soon. And next, we have Oklahoma moving up 2 spots. The Sooners to number 13. The Sooners look pretty strong against Temple. Jackson Arnold looked pretty great. He had 4 touchdowns, but Temple isn't great, so we don't have them moving up any further. 13, nothing to sneeze at. And right after them, we have Miami, who moves up 4 spots to number 12. They looked amazing versus Florida, and the opponent quality is much higher than a Vanderbilt or a Georgia Tech or an Oklahoma or any other team that rose this week. We've talked about their game this week, but Miami is our highest riser. Next, we have Utah moving up a spot. Cam Rising hasn't missed a step. Hard to fully judge them because their opponent was Southern Utah, but I think the concerns about Rising having some rust have been mitigated for the most part. Defense looked great. Nothing bad to say about Utah. Next, we have Penn State at 10. No need to rehatch this one. Penn State had a great showing, but so did pretty much every team above them, which is why they're not moving up at all this week. Next is Tennessee. Great performance from Nico and Tennessee as a whole. Very excited for their matchup next week. They could be dangerous this year with Nico taking over. And they have a very solid defense, which is the same for number 8 Missouri. Brady Cook was able to connect with almost all of his receivers. He did great at spreading the ball around. Likewise, the rushing attack was great, and 4 or 5 backs were able to get touches in this one. Missouri is very good and very deep on both sides. Murray State isn't a great opponent, but you're going to be okay with a shutout whenever you can get it, especially when the second or third strings come in and they're just as strong as the first strings. And at 7, we have Alabama. They're also much of the same as the last two. They started off slow, but they were able to kick it into gear in the second half. They need to get it going quicker in their next few matchups, but we have no worries for them at this point. A team we do have worries for, though, is our number 6 team. It's Oregon. They're dropping 2 spots. And it's curious to us. We think they still have a ton of talent, obviously. We don't think there's a ton to worry about, but they did not play great versus Idaho. We think it's more playing down to their opponent than a lack of talent, obviously. So we think they'll drastically improve over the next couple of weeks. But for the performance this week, we feel like we have to move them down, especially since the next 2 teams had much better performances, starting with Notre Dame at number 5. They move up 1 spot. Very good team all around. They're not going to drop 50 on most people, but they're for sure going to hold their opponents to low scores most of the time. They have a truly elite defense, and the offense looks better and less one-dimensional than it did last year. Very scary for anyone with Notre Dame on their schedule this year. Same for number 4, Ole Miss. They also move up 1 spot. Absolutely destroyed Furman. Jackson Dart was in his bag, and he's looking to have one of the best seasons in the conference. We think they're a top 4 team at this point. Maybe a bit of an overreaction, but they have looked amazing so far. And into the top 3. At 3, we have Texas, team we haven't talked about at all in this video, even though they played a pretty decent opponent in Colorado State. Texas is about what we expected. They're absolutely a top 3 team, and they could even be a bit better than our next team, which is Ohio State at number 2. They got started slow. They didn't look utterly dominant like Ole Miss or Texas, but we are still super confident in them overall. We're seeing a lot of overreactions from fans and media. We still consider them to be a top 4 team, and for now, we still have them at number 2. And at number 1, who else would it be but the Georgia Bulldogs? They dominated what should be a pretty solid Clemson team. We've dogged on Clemson a lot in this video, and it's mostly tough love because they did play Georgia. We think Beck looks phenomenal. Nate Frazier broke out and had a great performance in Etienne's absence. And Georgia is still our top team, and we feel pretty confident in them at that top position. And that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the week 2 preview.